In this video, I will be discussing the different arguments made for and against trade protectionism, as well as analyzing the free trade versus protectionism debate. So let's get started with arguments for trade protectionism. First off, trade protectionism helps maintain national health, environmental, and security standards. Governments are obliged to make sure that their country and citizens are safe, and trade protectionism can be used to enforce laws on imported goods and services. One example of this is the UK's recent ban on Canadian beef, as Canadian beef is hormone treated, which goes against the United Kingdom's health standards. Secondly, trade protectionism is used to correct the balance of payments, which are known as records of transactions in trade, as well as the flow of capital between a nation and the rest of the world. This includes the exchange of goods and services in a nation through the use of exports and imports, and using trade protectionism can help restrict imports, which reduces trade deficit and thus prevents an excessive outflow of money. We can see this when Ghana restricted imports on 22 different products in November of last year, as trade protectionism helped balance exports and imports of goods and services in and out of the nation. This seemed to work as the percentage of GDP spent on imports was 28.52%, and the percentage of GDP earned from exports was 29.91%. Trade protectionism is also used to protect jobs and infant industries, which are industries that have just opened up and don't yet have access to economies of scale, as they are liable to competition from industries from abroad. An example of this in the real world is Japan's protection of their automotive industry in the 1970s, when the automotive industry was still in its infantile stage, as trade protectionism was used to protect their own car manufacturers from foreign competition. Next, countries advocate for protectionism because it reduces the possibility of dumping and unfair competition. To explain what dumping is, let's get our friend Michael Scott from The Office to give us a little demonstration.
Here's the thing about those discount suppliers. They don't care. They come in, they undercut everything, and they run us out of business. And then, once we're all gone, they jack up the prices.
I don't know.
It's bad.
It's terrible.
You know what? It really is.
Dumping occurs when foreign firms export at a price below the standard price to get a foothold in the market, which outcompetes other domestic firms. In response to this, countries might use trade protectionism to prevent other foreign firms from encroaching in their markets. And this occurred in the early 2000s when the US and many other countries accused Asian countries like China of dumping in the steel market, resulting in larger tariffs being placed on those imports. Economically least developed countries, or ELDCs for short, also need trade protectionism to protect key industries in the short run, since industrial foundations might not be very strong. By protecting these key industries, it might allow them to develop a wider range of goods and services, and we can currently see this in India, as governments are subsidizing agriculture and fishing, which are two of their key industries due to the very fertile and abundant land in India. Since agriculture and fishing are primary industries, this might allow India to produce other processed goods as well, such as canned food. So now we've gone over the major arguments made for trade protectionism, but what are the arguments against trade protectionism? First off, trade protectionism creates a misallocation of resources, also known as deadweight loss for society, which happens when resources are not used most optimally. Tariffs and quotas create deadweight loss for consumers, as consumers are forced to spend higher prices on goods and services for a smaller quantity. All three monetary-related policies will create misallocation for firms because the resources used by domestic firms could have otherwise been used more efficiently by foreign firms. A real-world example of this could be seen in how the US tariffs on global vehicle exports in 2016 led to a welfare loss of around negative 0.15%. There might also be a lack of incentive for domestic firms to be more efficient if trade protectionism is set in place. This is because there's no competition or threat from foreign firms, which usually drives domestic firms to innovate and invest in better infrastructure or operations. Without such a threat, there might not be as great of a drive for domestic firms to refine their production and continue to use less optimal factors of production. Also, exporters might retaliate against countries that implement trade protectionism, which usually lead to trade wars. Going back to the previous example of the UK's ban on Canadian beef, Canada retaliated by placing tariffs on cheese from the UK, causing British producers to pay higher duties of 245%. Lastly, consumers will have to experience increased costs of goods and services as well as less choice. This happened in the banana trade wars in 1993 between the US and the EU, where the EU introduced trade protectionism to protect domestic banana production. As a result of this, banana prices in the EU rose by 40%. So let's get back to the whole debate on free trade versus protectionism. Which one is better? Well, there really doesn't seem to be a right answer, so let's go over why that is. People argue that free trade allows nations to specialize in goods and services that they have a comparative advantage in producing, like Canada and maple syrup. This should hopefully lead to a rise in the overall world output and leads to a welfare gain for society as a whole. Free trade prevents misallocation of resources that would otherwise occur in trade protectionism, which we can see on all three trade protectionism diagrams. On the other hand, trade protectionists argue that trade protectionism can lead to economic growth because it makes domestic prices more competitive and leads to more domestic output. We can see this on an economies of scale graph as domestic producers are protected against foreign competition, and thus the average price of production goes down since firms can become more efficient. Pro-trade protectionists also argue that the government earns revenue from tariffs and that this revenue can be used to build infrastructure that furthers economic trade and growth. However, there's also the argument made by free trade advocates that the governments might be susceptible to corruption, and that government money might not be spent in the best way possible. Because of how complex the world actually is and the many assumptions that have been made about it, it can be seen how trade protectionism and free trade seem to work better on a case-by-case basis, and that one is not inherently better than the other. So to quickly summarize, the pros of trade protectionism include safeguarding national health, environmental, and safety standards, correcting balance of payments, protecting infant industries and jobs, preventing dumping and unfair competition, and supporting ELDCs. Cons of trade protectionism include misallocation of resources, lack of incentive for firms' efficiency, retaliation from exporters, and higher prices and less choice for consumers. Free trade advocates argue for the specialization of goods and services leading to more overall world output and against government inefficiency from revenue earned. In contrast, trade protectionists argue that the government will be able to redistribute the revenue into society and that trade protectionism leads to domestic economic growth. Thank you so much for watching this video, hope you enjoyed.